In 1941, when the Russian-German War broke out, my husband was mobilized into the Soviet military, and I, with my 2 children, a daughter aged 7 and a boy aged 3 years old, remained alone, living at home in the city of Chortkiv, western Ukraine. I survived innumerable slaughters. The first Jewish victims in our shtetl fell only a few days after the occupation of our region by the Germans. They ordered a few hundred Jewish men to gather in a square for work. The men gathered in the square, but instead of taking them to work, they took them to prison, and later the Germans, together with the local Ukrainians, murdered them in a brutal fashion, and they buried some alive. These were the best people from our city. A few days later, we received news from my hometown, Zalishchiki, 5 kilometers from us, where my parents and sisters still lived, that the Gestapo there had issued an order. 500 Jews should come to clean the barracks. If they would not heed the command, they would kill all the Jews of the city. The order was fulfilled, and all 500 Jews were taken to a place outside the city. They lined them up 10 in a row, one behind the other, and each row was shot with 1 bullet. Obviously, from such shooting, most were only wounded, and some were not even touched, but the Germans ignored this and buried them all alive. Among the victims were my father and my 2 younger sisters, aged 18 and 20 years old. In March 1942, they carried out among us in the shtetl the first formal slaughter, and immediately after this, they ordered us to move into the ghetto. I went to the ghetto with my children. The conditions there were terrible. After only 6 weeks, they sent us to Zalishchiki. After laboring 3 months in Zalishchiki, in September 1942, an order arrived that the camp there must be free of Jews. Then they sent us to Tovste. Tovste was an assembly point for the murder of Jews, and we arrived here exactly as they were carrying out an extermination action. I managed to hide, together with my children. We did not rest for long. In a few weeks' time, there once again took place here a slaughter, during which over 2,000 Jews were killed. The panic in the city was terrible, because no one had imagined that so quickly, after such a short breathing space, another slaughter would take place. I hid in a cellar, together with my children and another 7 people. Altogether, there were 10 of us. That winter, we remained in Tovste. In the beginning of May 1943, there again took place here a great slaughter. My family, the 3 of us, hid in an attic and thus survived. Lying here a few days, my younger child seemed to understand the situation and did not even ask for water. During the time in the attic, we heard heart-rending cries, screams, and calls for help. Many of the victims fled, but the local population, the Ukrainians, chased after them, beat them, and later murdered them in a terrible fashion. Those few Jews who remained alive, in hiding, were later sorted. The older people were sent to Chortkiv and the younger to the camps. Together with my family, I stole out from the camp at night, and we set out for Lisivtsi, 7 kilometers from Tovste. For 6 weeks it was calm, and then they again began a Jewish action. We fled from the city with a group of people, but we were noticed by the Germans, and they immediately opened fire on us with machine guns. Straight away, there were 32 victims from our group. Among them was my mother. My daughter was hit by a bullet in her foot, but we were already in the field. We hid among the crops until nightfall. At night, with great effort, we returned to Tovste. The first medical help that my daughter received was from Dr. Greenberg. And only thanks to the doctor's extraordinary efforts was it possible to save the foot. She only lost her toes. Later, when the situation in Tovste was again in a state of tension, we once more left for Lisivtsi. In Lisivtsi, there was still a camp of 200 Jews who worked at agricultural labor, the men in the stables and the women in the fields. We received food once per day. The Ukrainian police would very often fall upon our camp and murder whoever fell into their hands. Likewise, due to the hunger and terrible living conditions, a typhus epidemic broke out. Here, the Ukrainians did not take care of the sick, and anyone who became ill was immediately shot. No one reacted to all of this, because the law was to beat the Jews. March 1st, 1944, when the Soviet armies advanced, the Germans and Ukrainians, together with the Vlasovites, became completely wild and dealt out murder right and left. They caught a Jewish woman from Vienna with her son and shot them. A woman from the shtetl, Igolnitz, they took a knife. Her ears and nose, and afterwards they shot her. March 23, 1944, the Soviets liberated our region. We were barely 8 days with the Soviets when the Germans again renewed their attack, and the town once again passed to their hands. Then, in a burning frost, starving, exhausted, naked, and barefoot, we fled for 60 kilometers to Chernivtsi. Many of us froze. We had to leave them on the way. We remained in Chernivtsi until the end of the war.